Inshallah, we are going to live now. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good evening to all panels and audiences to our program tonight. We are going to start our program, inshallah. And tonight we are going to discuss on this WASATI number 37 on the topic of gender inequality and poverty. And we are going to introduce our panel, Dr. Fatimah Al-Zahra Al-Attas, and she had gained his PhD in Sociology in University of Wellington, and he is now a lecturer in IIUM. And she had worked diligently in many areas regarding social issues, and had written some articles like in such platforms such as The Star, and also we have two our guests as a commentator, Brother Akil Azmi, our SKIL fellow, and our sister Rohia Sakina from Psychology IIM. So inshallah, we will start our program, and we like to pass to the floor to Dr. Fatimah, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much to School of Islamic Thought Malaysia for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here, and fellow speakers that will be joining today. I'm really excited to hear everybody's sharing, and I hope that we will all learn together tonight. Thank you for the introduction. So tonight we are going to talk about gender inequality and poverty. How shall we start this? It's a lot, isn't it? When we talk about gender inequality and poverty, there are a lot of concepts that we are dealing with. So the best thing for us to do is actually to try to unpack the terms and how I will be using them tonight, so that it clarifies the boundaries of what we are going to discuss, and perhaps we can always talk about these boundaries as well later on if you have any questions, or if you want to bring other issues to mind, so that will be okay as well. So the first term we want to talk about is gender inequality. This itself is a very big concept, and it's also dealing with a lot of different things. So when we talk about gender inequality, we want to look at the concept of gender. In this context, we're looking at the social construct, and we're looking at how society imposes certain values, certain gender roles, certain ideas about femininity and masculinity. So we want to, for example, we're looking at certain social attributes, and these are very contextual attributes, and it may change over time, and it may be different according to different societies. So for example, what is considered feminine in one society may not be considered feminine in another society. And over time, we can also see what was considered masculine may no longer be considered masculine today. For example, the use of high heel shoes. Okay, in English societies in the past, high heel shoes was considered a masculine wear for men to use, and then when women started wearing them, it changed to become something more feminine, and today still considered a feminine object of clothing, for example, or fashion. Similarly, in terms of actions or behavior, so essentially we're looking at social attributes that defines or that adds to the character of femininity and masculinity, and is very contextual depending on the society or social group that we're looking at. Okay. So when we're talking about gender inequality, we may also be looking at the term gender equality, right? So I'd like to point us to the direction of gender equality first before we look at the opposing term of gender inequality. When we're talking about gender inequality, we're looking at the rights, the responsibilities, and also I want to emphasize on opportunities because today we're talking about poverty as well. So the rights, responsibilities, and opportunities that are given to somebody, okay, is not dependent on whether they are born male or female. So this is a state of gender equality. So we give rights and we give responsibilities and we give opportunities to people not because of the gender that they are born with. And this includes visibility, this includes empowerment, okay, this includes how they are being treated as a child, the kind of opportunities that are given to them, the kind of visibility that people see in terms of their capabilities and capacities to do things. So the opposite is when it is dependent on whether they are born male and female, then we see gender inequality. All right, so we will discuss more about gender inequality later on in terms of what are some of the areas which we can see gender inequality, what are the impacts of gender inequality, and then perhaps we can discuss briefly in the context of Malaysia, I think, because we are dealing with the Malaysian context, and it may be something that is more relatable to us to see things closer to where we are, and context is also very important. Okay, the next term we want to look at is poverty. Okay, poverty is a state of not having enough, essentially. Okay, but when we talk about poverty, generally we're looking at two materials or two terms. Okay, especially for sociologists, because I'm a sociologist. One is the absolute poverty, the other one is relative poverty. So when we're talking about absolute poverty, it is a state where even the basic needs cannot be met. So for example, food, shelter, clothing. So even not having basic needs for a healthy life. And then we focus on relative poverty. So relative poverty looks at the standard of living of a particular society and then sees whether or not somebody has poverty in that area. Okay, but the problem with relative poverty is that in a state or in a nation or society where it is very dire, or even the basic rights are not met by more people, then we cannot help a lot more people, because we're talking about everybody having absolute poverty or having a bigger range of poverty, especially if we're looking at just one nation. We're not looking at relative poverty between nations. So that's also important for us to look at. Okay. And then in the context of Malaysia today, it is also interesting for us to consider urban poverty and rural poverty, because urban poverty is something that's uprising, especially with the impact of pandemic, right? We have a larger population in the urban areas. Urbanization has been happening, and we are trying to progress very quickly as a society in terms of economic development, right? But then we are also seeing higher rates of urban poverty, which shows in terms of, for example, issues relating to child malnourishment. So these are issues relating to poverty in Malaysia. And then we also have rural poverty. Okay, rural poverty, it looks different than urban poverty. And I'll talk about this a little bit later and show some examples based on my own work on period poverty. Okay. All right, so now we can jump on to gender inequality and poverty. So one of the things that we can talk about when we talk about gender inequality and poverty is we want to look at poverty as a whole. So poverty affects a lot of people, right? It affects different groups of people, not just one group of people. So there's diversity in terms of the identities of people who are affected by poverty. So this includes gender, this includes age, includes ethnicity, it also includes for example, locality like urban and rural. And it doesn't impact all of these identities and groups of people in the same way. So when we're talking about gender Ida, can you mute your mic? Thank you. Okay. Sorry, there was a bit of a technical issue there. Okay, so when we're talking about gender inequality and poverty, we're definitely looking at how gender affects poverty. We're looking at how women or men are affected by poverty. Okay, and that's very important for us to talk about context now. So in the world that we live in today, generally we see gender inequality as a female issue, even though gender inequality is not only a female issue, but we see that in most patriarchal societies, women are more severely affected or negatively affected by gender inequality. So when we're talking about gender inequality and poverty, we're looking at what we call a feminization of poverty. Okay, so feminization of poverty is when poverty happens, okay, and how it impacts more on women. So we're looking at things that increases poverty in women or among women. So we're not dissecting something at a specific frame. We're looking at things as a whole. So it's not trying to look at one area, for example, gender gap. We're not just looking at gender pay gap, for example, or access to education, but we're looking at things as a whole. How being female increases the progress of poverty. In this case, we're looking at how over time it will be more and more difficult for women to come out of poverty. Okay, and then we're also looking at how hard is it to overcome, and then also the burden of experiencing poverty as female. So it is something that happens over time. So it's not just one section of, for example, 2021, how women are experiencing poverty. But when we're talking about feminization of poverty, we're looking at over time how this progresses. And this definitely relates to the issue of gender inequality, how the social structure, whether it reduces the opportunities for women or gives them less rights in terms of access to certain things like access to equal pay, access to education, for example, or better healthcare, mental health issues, for example, affects them in the long run, okay, and also then affects the next generation of women as well. So we are definitely seeing that as something that is organic, something that is alive, and it continues to be dynamic. So it's not just something that is still and we can just snapshot it and then we try to fix that. Okay, there are always interconnecting factors and issues relating to that. Okay, I hope things are clear for now in terms of how we understand things. Okay, how does gender inequality happen? When we talk about gender inequality, I think we have to address, especially in the Malaysian context, that there is a stigma about talking about gender inequality, or sometimes there is a stigma of gender inequality as a topic itself. So we need to look at the issue of gender inequality in a more objective way in trying to understand how there are certain social structures, there are also certain types of socialization and also cultural beliefs that reduces the equalities or reduces the rights, responsibilities, and opportunities for women, and by virtue of being women within the social context. So we have to look at what are the factors and what are the areas in which we can see gender inequality happening. Okay, so I'll give some examples. We have issues relating to abuse, for example, sexual abuse as girls. Okay, it's not saying that the sexual abuse does not happen to boys, but it's also looking at the rates of abuse that happens to young girls. And then in the context of Malaysia, we actually have higher rates of success at school for girls than we have for boys. So education is not something that we probably look at in Malaysia in terms of access to education, but there are certain things that impact access to education and impact the quality of education that girls receive by virtue of being girls within our society. And then we have issues, for example, relating to child marriages, issues relating to exploitation. And then we also look at cases relating to divorce, or we're looking at cases relating to gender pay gap at the adulthood. Okay. So we can see differences in how women experience life within our community and our society, and how that's different from men, and how this structure of the society actually reduces the chances. Okay, so maybe I can share a little bit on my work on period poverty, and how we can see little things or things that are seemingly little affects things in the long run and affects girls differently than it would affect boys, for example. And then we can bring on the issue of gender inequality, and we also can talk about poverty. So when we talk about period poverty, we're looking at four things, right? So period poverty is number one, lack of access to menstrual product. Number two, lack of access to wash facilities, which is water, sanitation, and for example, hand soap, toilets, okay? And then number three is lack of access to education about menstruation, about reproductive health. And then number four, finally, is about privacy, the ability to manage menstrual hygiene properly in a safe and private way. So poverty is not the only reason women or girls would experience period poverty. Say, for example, if we're talking about education, in the context where a society stigmatizes menstruation, then most people within the community or society might have problems accessing the right knowledge about menstruation. So in that context, a lot more people, even outside of the poverty group, out of the poor group, might also experience period poverty. But poverty definitely aggravates the problem of period poverty. That means it definitely aggravates the situation for young women or women who have to experience life. So menstruation comes every month for between 3 to 10 days, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, depending on the cycle, whether it's healthy or not healthy. So it's a big chunk of a woman's life where women experience it for 30 or so years of their life. Okay, so you can imagine not being able to manage that time of the month every single month and how that would impact women's life. So number one, for example, not having access to product means that girls and women cannot go to school, cannot go to work. And this happens to quite a number of women, and we don't research about this enough. Number two, it also affects their ability to access certain opportunities by virtue of not going to school and not going to work. They're missing out on school. They're missing out on education, which obviously will have a long-term impact. So what we're finding is if girls miss out 3 days, which is when there is heavy flow, they might go to school when there's no heavy flow, but because they don't have access to menstrual product, they're missing out 3 to 5 days a month on school. So in a year, we're looking at 2 months. 2 months of school that girls miss out by not having access to sanitary product. And then if we talk about girls who have access to sanitary product, but don't have access to wash facilities, to clean water, toilet, proper facilities, and they cannot manage that. That means they also may choose to use their menstrual product longer because they don't want to go to the toilets to change it, or they cannot go to the toilets to change it. Then they will, what we're finding is they will not join co-curricular activities at school. So this again affects their life opportunities and how they experience life. So that's just one element, which is we don't talk about it enough, and the stigma around period poverty itself makes the problem bigger or makes it harder for us to address the problem. So that's one, okay? And then we look at one of the major issues when we talk about gender inequality, especially in the context of Malaysia, we're looking at the issue of care work or unpaid care work. So when we talk about work, there are two types of work, right? So there's paid work and then there's unpaid work. So paid work is when you go out, either you work for someone as an employer, as an employee, or you are self-employed and you do work and you get income. There is a financial transaction for your work. You are being paid for the work that you do. But there is care work, in which across the board, whether globally, generally, women will do more of the unpaid care work, and even more so in Malaysia, because care work, it is attached to gender. It is assumed that this is a gendered work that women have to do or that girls have to do. So we see that women are given more responsibility, and also they are expected to invest their time to do care work, whether it is doing household work, cleaning, washing, and then or taking care of people. For example, caring for children, caring for the sick, caring for elderlies. And most of the time, this work is not paid work. And if it is paid much less than other forms of work. So we can see that even when women access employment, okay, the forms of employment that we see women do even in Malaysia are employments relating to, majorly relating to care work, or majorly relating to employment that are not paid sufficiently. So we see a pay gap. So we can see a lot of different things that happens within societies limits women's ability to access proper or better quality of life. And then if we talk about poverty, then we can see the gravity of the situation increases, or it becomes severe because the burden increases. I can give an example of a snapshot of life for women who may be living in the PPR, in the B40 group, and what the family life can look like, okay? And this is based on some of the research that we are doing in the PPR areas. So generally, there will be several number of children living in a small household, okay? We're also seeing a higher rate of unemployment among the male members. So most of the time, we are seeing a higher rate of female-headed household. So women are working. Most of the time we're looking at mothers who are working, and they're not working one job, they're working two jobs because they're not getting good jobs, right? So they're doing a lot of jobs that are paid very poorly. So they're doing two jobs. But at the same time, we also expect within this context of society, we also expect women to do the care work. So because the mother is unable to do the care work, sometimes because she's doing two jobs and three jobs, and in some cases, to add to this situation, some of these mothers are actually on drugs, not because they are taking drugs for fun, they are taking drugs to increase their performance, for them to be able to work harder so that they can provide for their family. So these mothers are working full-time, so they will pass on the responsibility of doing the care work typically to the eldest female child of the family. So we are also noticing that children, okay, especially female children, take on more housework than male children. And I don't think this is news to anybody who lives in Malaysian context. This is something familiar to us. For most families, or even if we don't practice it in our family, we know our friends, or we see things in our textbook. For children, that most of the household tasks are done by women, and then the pictures of children playing are typically of boys, right? So some of these girls unfortunately have to sacrifice their education. So we can see how not only are they affected by gender inequality in terms of having to do more unpaid care work or housework, they are also in a position of poverty. So for them to get out of poverty, when we talk about social mobility, it makes it even harder for women. So this is just an example, one example for us to be able to relate to what the situation can look like and would look like for women, and then how it affects intergeneration. The other issue when we talk about gender inequality, we can also look at issues relating to divorce. So we know that we have a higher rate of divorce, and it is something that is worrying a lot of people. We can see a lot more attention is given through the media in terms of the pandemic and the impact on divorce. Even before the pandemic, we were seeing higher rates of divorce, and especially among Muslim families, that's happening. So what happens when we look at issues relating to divorce, we are seeing another example of female-headed household. So when we see female-headed household, okay, in this numbers of poverty, we look at household income, okay. Within the household income group, okay, the biggest number is among female-headed household rather than male-headed household. So this is another example of the feminization of poverty, okay. So as we see the divorce rates increasing, then we will see a higher rate of female-headed household. And then we can see how poverty may continue to spread, and also it makes it harder for us to get out of poverty, or it makes it harder for women to get out of poverty and their families also to get out of poverty. And then we can also look at female-headed household or female-headed families that are afflicted or that begins through teenage pregnancies, right? When we talk about teenage pregnancies, generally we're not looking at males at all. We're just looking at teenage mothers, right? Even though it didn't happen she didn't do it on her own, but the impact of teenage pregnancy is only experienced by the female member, right? So that's another impact of inequality. And generally, it's very hard for young women to get out of poverty when they are already a teenage mom, because of access to education, because access to life opportunities, and then we're talking also about access to care for their children, childcare. So if we don't see care work as something that is gendered, then we can start fixing the problem. So this is one of the ways out of gender inequality, and this is also one of the things that we need to start talking about. We really have to talk about care work in terms of it breaking gender inequality in the context of our society, because it impacts things in a big way. Okay, so that will be one of the solutions that we will discuss also in terms of breaking gender inequality. So maybe before we start talking about addressing gender inequality, maybe we want to talk about why it's important for us to address gender inequality, and why is there so much stigma when we talk about gender inequality. One of the explanations that we can give when we talk about gender inequality and why it's so hard to talk about it and why there's a lot of pushback is because of the nature of power structure. Okay, if we talk about any form of inequality, whether it's wealth, whether it is gender, whether it is ethnic inequality, we always have to consider the power structure and the power dynamics of the conversation. So there will always be pushback because of the context in which gender inequality happens. And so if we want to break gender inequality, we have to acknowledge that the pushback will happen. Sometimes it's funny to think that we have to justify why we need gender equality, isn't it? As though the impact of gender inequality is not enough, as though the impact on the safety of women, the impact of the reduced opportunities for women, the impact on the reduced opportunities for women, and then that affecting our country's economy or people's safety or the peacefulness of our society, or the happiness of our families, for example, even within intimate relationships, as though those are not enough, that we should have people be treated equally. So sometimes we do have to justify why we need gender inequality and why gender inequality benefits everybody. I wrote a simple article on this, if you are looking for it, okay, on the Star. It's a very simple article on why gender equality would benefit everyone. Okay, but let's look at some of the things that we would benefit from if we work towards gender equality. Okay, sometimes the word gender equality really strikes a chord with some people. So maybe if we can just sort of put that aside for a while and think about why it is beneficial for everybody. Number one, when we're talking about gender equality, we're looking at prevention of violence against women and children. How gender equality affects that is, number one, we will look at better legal forms or legal structures that would support women and children who are affected by abuse. So if we're thinking about reporting, if we're thinking about women being able to go out and get legal support, okay, and also the process being faster for women to get out of those dangerous relationship. And number three, we're also looking at support among family members, among friends, not to gaslight women, for example, or not victim blame women and girls who are already going through violence. So that should be, I think, a really good motivation for us to want things to be better. And then we're also looking at it is just good for the country, for women and girls to have better access to education, better access to equal pay, because it benefits the economy of the country. So if we can, for example, transform care work into an economy or into something that is lucrative and turn it into something that pays, that would benefit our society as a whole. So in the context of Malaysia, we're looking at 55.2% of women in the workforce. Okay, that is an improvement if we look over time, but that's still not enough. Okay, and that's not just because women don't want to work. Okay, if we talk about the social context, there are women who choose not to work, but that's mostly because of the socialization and the culture around women working, and sometimes how there is a contradiction between women wanting to work and women expected to do care work, and trying to manage that can be more challenging for women than choosing not to work, for example. And then we also have the benefit of better families or happier families. And this is something that is more interpersonal, something that's a bit more micro. So families who have better or more equal distribution of power. So we're looking at a better power dynamics among spouses. Okay, this would have a healthier relationship, or people would experience healthier relationships and would be happier with each other. And obviously, we're looking at lower rates of abuse, we're looking at lower rates of divorce. And then obviously that would have an impact on children, and we would see happier children, and also the impact of gender equality on children and how we treat children of different genders is also important. And that would mean that we would have a generational change in terms of improving our society as a whole. Okay, I think I'm about to run out of time shortly. Let's talk about how we can go about it. Okay, what can we do to sort of break apart the problem of gender inequality and also the problem of poverty, and how when we talk about the feminization of poverty and how women are more affected by poverty and how that happens over a long term of a long period of time, and also how that continues on for over generations. Okay, number one, we need more active support from men, because sometimes when we talk about gender inequality, like I said, or gender equality or anything relating to gender, sometimes the word gender is synonymous to female, but when we're talking about gender, we're not really talking about female. So we need more active support from men to break the cycle or to break that. Okay, so that number one, for example, like I said just now, we need to address the issue of domestic work or unpaid care work. And this means for men to do more of the unpaid care work. Okay, it sounds very simplistic, but it's also something that's very important to break the notion of gender roles that involves doing housework, and that work is only for women. Because over time, women are expected to participate in society, they have access to education, and then they are also taking on student loan, for example, and then with higher cost of living, we are looking at more women expected to also participate in the labor force. So that means that in order for things to happen, there needs to also be progress. That women are also taking on roles outside of the home. That means we also need to see that there is a better distribution of domestic work at home. And then we also need to ensure that there is an active support in terms of policy making, and that's very important. When we're talking about policy making, we need to start looking at policy making from a gender mainstream kind of perspective, and that's something that we've been trying to do, but we are still lacking in a few areas. So we need to start seeing how certain policies are impacting certain gender, for example, and how when we are making policies or thinking about policies, we are considering gender as a important factor. And this includes addressing issues relating to access to opportunities, and then, for example, looking at issues relating to poverty or menstrual health. And then I think it's also important to address the issue of mental health, which I think is a very interesting area when we look at gender in Malaysia. If we look at the suicide rates in the last year from the impact of the pandemic, unlike a lot of other societies, we see a higher rate of suicide among young women than, for example, other age group, and also other gender. So that's a very it's an indicator, and it's something that we need to ask ourselves, why is it that in our country suicide rates are higher among young women than other age groups or other genders? So that's something that is important for us to watch out for, and that's also another indicator of gender inequality. So we have to consider how policies would have or could have a positive or a negative impact if we look at the issues relating to gender. And that's important for us to do. And then obviously we have the role of media, which is, I think, is very powerful form of propagating or changing social and cultural ways of doing things. So it's a very strong socialization agent, meaning that it's a strong agent for people to learn from about gender roles. If we watch, for example, movies or shows about what women are supposed to do, how they're supposed to behave, women are supposed to be submissive and permissive, for example, or women learn to stand up for themselves, or women who work are not always seen to be failing in one area or the other. And always the focus on women failing in managing work and in managing family, rather than focusing on how men can be supportive or showing positive roles in terms of gender relative roles. So that's very important for us to consider the role of media and how people learn from the media in terms of issues relating to either gender equality or gender inequality. Okay, I think I will stop here. If there are further questions, I'll be happy to respond to them. I'm not sure who's supposed to take over from here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Fatimah, for the talk and explanation about the things that related to the issues of equality, gender, and how the system and how social context operates. So we welcome Sister Ruhia as our first commentator to comment on the presentation by Dr. Fatimah.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So you can hear me? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fatimah. So glad to see you. I was an IIUM graduate before. Both my degree and masters was there in psychology. But now I pursuing my PhD in other place. So in UMT now. So it's very important. It's very interesting topic, by the way. When the organizer gave me the topic, the first thing that would come in my mind was when we talk about gender inequality and poverty, we would think of the economic or something related to economic base. Like we would think of poverty in terms of the pay or the living costs and everything else. And you explain there are many elements basically in poverty, especially is very important topic or interesting topic is period poverty. So period poverty, I think the awareness is not so much for now. We will not, it's still stigmatized in our society. People will still feel that period, associate period with the something that we call dirty. And this is a very important highlight. Maybe like for the discussion, we could discuss more on period poverty. Could be very interesting. And you also mentioned about mental health. Yeah, you know, you mentioned about something mental health related. I think it could also be part of poverty as well. We can see as mental health poverty because when we see issue related to poverty, it's very related to mental health because violence, discrimination, and all that is actually come from there. So I am more I mean I am more interested in terms of what we can do about it. You mentioned a lot about education. You mentioned about policy making. We need to touch up a lot more. But one thing or one important core in this discussion, I could say this is can be seen from the part of education. So education can be maybe can be seen in educating the woman itself and also educating the society aside from women. This include the part of the children, educating the men. Talking about the educating a woman, we could understand that giving them education, giving them access to education. But talking about the very hard part is to educate the men part, because when we talk about to educate or to make the men to get support into what we could say as the process of breaking the gender inequality, is basically something that a bit hard. So what I can say is we could touch up from maybe two different perspectives. The first one is the mobilization or the men part as a whole. Another one is we could say from the perspective, the aspect of the children. It's very important for us to start with, because you also mentioned about the generation part, where we can say that education, we understand that education should be started from very, very small age of the children. So start from that, we educate the boys to join us to understand that to break the gender inequality from the micro level. So people might argue that this one will be very hard or long journey, but yeah, we understand the process of breaking the socialization part or the society based thing is, is a process. So although we understand one part that we need to touch up, so we have to look another part as well. So in other words, there will have to be many different parts to be touched up in terms of in discussing, or in terms of what we can do about breaking down the culture or the stigma of the gender inequality. So for me, that my take home lah. I think that those things actually make me think of we are actually need also to focus on like the micro part, which means that it could start from the school, or the micro level, to start from the school or the children at a young age. So that one will actually a starting point, a process to become the next generation punya outcome. We could say outcome. So it's very important in terms of managing, or to say about what we can do is to actually breaking down the solution into different parts. So I think that one that one is what I mentioned about education in terms of educate women in society, and then we also talk about how we need to get men into support. So this one always like disturbed my mind. So how to actually we really get the men to support. Although some men would in terms of what we call as in terms of literally they understand, like what we say, what we can say is in the paper they understand. Ideally this should be, women should cannot be discriminated, but practically somehow it actually embedded within our culture. So benda tu macam dah jadi satu benda yang dah automatic, especially in terms of pay. We understand we should have equal pay, Tapi bila in terms of implementation, you will go for no, because men need more um, pay because they have people to like under them. So we have to really balance in terms of ideal and practical things. So I think that's only my comment. So I'll give back to the host.
Thank you, Sister Ria, for the comment. And we welcome Brother Akil Azmi as the second commentator.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim. Salatu wassalamu ala rasulihil amin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Terima kasih kepada saudara moderator, terima kasih kepada panelis-panelis. Very interesting talk. First of all, saya kena apologize because I'm way out of my depth here. So bukan bidang saya, and I learned a lot of new things tadi. But if there's one thing that I found interesting dalam apa yang Dr. Fatimah Al-Attas sebut tadi is how the distribution of opportunities in a society between different genders boleh be affected by certain social structures and cultural practices. And I think this is very interesting. It's about one of the things I learned was that like for every action that someone does is that there is an underlying factor behind it. Like there's a motivating factor ataupun there's a sort of worldview yang motivates them to act in a certain way. So when we look at the issue of discrimination towards women, then obviously there is an underlying underlying mentality or underlying principle yang perpetuates this problem. And I think one of the important things is to first of all recognize what this underlying motivation is kalau kita nak tackle the issue of gender inequality. Sebab from my personal observation, I see that sometimes some activists, diorang focus on a lot of, say, like policy reform and like practical solutions, I would say, which I think is commendable. Like those things have its merits. But I think if we don't tackle the issue from its root problem, which is this macam embedded mentality that some people have through culture, through macam lack of education and awareness, then the problem will just manifest itself in different ways. Macam say the problem exists now, and then we propose a new legal method ataupun like a new policy to combat it. But if the underlying mentality still exists, then like the discrimination will just manifest itself in some other way. Contohnya, I think like say for example like a company, let's say there's a hypothetical company yang doesn't allow women to work in their company, and let's say like there's a new policy reform that people advocate for that allows women to work there now. But if the company still operates with a biased principle or with like a misogynistic worldview, then even when women still gets to work there, then the problem can manifest itself in different ways. They can still be exploited, they can be subject to like longer working hours. So I think the discussion about gender equality, like in terms of its practical solutions, in terms of policy reforms, I think those are very like good discussions, like very commendable. But I think there is in my personal opinion, I think there's a lack of focus on this, tackling this underlying issue, which is obviously harder because it's more abstract and people, that really see and experience it in front of their own eyes. But yeah, I think that it's worth sort of drawing people's attention towards it, and just so like we don't forget. And yeah, itu je yang that I can really add to this discussion. Wallah alam. Saya serahkan kembali kepada moderator.
Thank you, Brother Akil Azmi, for the comment. And maybe we welcome Dr. Fatimah for maybe another explanation, or maybe you want to add some points on the comments.
Okay, thank you so much. I think tadi Sister Ruhia mentioned pasal mental health again and how it affects women, and also when we talk about mental health and poverty, is another factor ataupun another area within the feminization of poverty kan, especially now when we're seeing mental health pandemic, and it's even more prevalent now ataupun lagi more visible, maybe not more prevalent, lebih visible sekarang because of the pandemic. We can really see kan. And then when we talk about mental health issues, we're also talking about how the structure affects mental health. And just like you said lah, if we're talking about gender inequality, we're looking at domestic violence, we're looking at stress factors, and then if we look at financial issues also affecting women. And then as a result of the mental health issues too, the access to healthcare and the access to mental health help is also reduced because of poverty. So benda tu dia macam berkali-kali berlaku. This is what I'm trying to say when we talk about the feminization of poverty. Dia isu tu mungkin kalau kita try to screenshot dia nampak macam a small issue. Tapi bila kita tengok benda tu as a whole, then we can see how it continues to impact one another, and then benda tu jadi is a very difficult issue to tackle. Unless macam Brother Akil mentioned tadi, unless we see where it's coming from and we can tackle that and we are able to look that in the eye, and that's very hard because the thing about social construct is benda tu we have internalized because we learn it over time, and then in different parts of our society we continue to perpetuate benda tu. So benda tu dah ada macam scaffold, dah ada foundation, and then and it is also an internal structure in our head because as human beings ataupun as social beings, that's how we learn to function in a society because human beings are social beings kan. And when we grow up in a particular society with a particular social and cultural upbringing, that's how we learn. For example, macam contoh orang Melayu kan, bila kita lalu depan orang tua, kita akan tunduk. Macam kita buat lalu tunduk tu macam very specific to our culture kan, but not other cultures, not all cultures buat benda tu. But imagine if we choose not to do it one day. Number one, internally it's challenging for us. Kita pun rasa macam susahnya nak lalu depan makcik ke pakcik kalau kita tak tunduk in that very specific way. Number two, we also see that the culture around us, makcik, pakcik ke abang ayah, kita akan marah kita. So dia ada internal aspect dan dia ada external aspect juga. So that's important. So that is kalau kita tengok macam familiar interaction. Tapi kalau kita tengok benda yang bigger like policy, benda yang bigger like legal structures, then it's the same. Education for example kan. Macam I cakap tadi lah, gender roles in the house tu kita boleh nampak benda tu everywhere. Dalam buku teks budak-budak kita boleh nampak kalau example buat kerja rumah je mesti perempuan. Jarang ada example buku teks budak buat kerja rumah tu budak lelaki ke bapa ke. Ataupun example main dekat luar mesti macam athletic, it's always male kan. And then benda tu contohnya in education, it already shows itself. Number two, then we see in media, kan, it's everywhere in the media. Jarang kita nampak. Kalau ada orang lelaki buat kerja rumah, it's like, wow, it's a great thing that men are doing housework. It's different when women do housework, tak ada pula macam get a big applause, except on Mother's Day, then they might get a big applause for that. Kan? And then we also see in terms of our laws and our regulation. We also see in terms of the value of work, macam paid work tadi I cakap in economics. So all of the different institutions will uphold benda tu. So to unpack it, it is difficult. It is very hard. And memang it's not something that can be done overnight. It's not something that we'll do next year. It's something that we have to continuously do and continuously unpack lah. And I agree, we have to start in different places. We cannot just focus on one area. Contohnya, when we talk about policy reform ke policy changes, we have to talk about gender mainstreaming. Bukannya changing the policy semata-mata to accommodate to certain issues. We have to come from a place where we acknowledge that there is gender inequality, then kita want to gender mainstream the policies. And then if we're talking about educating children in school, so we have to also implement benda tu, and then also trying to make changes to happen in people's personal lives juga. All of these things need to happen concurrently, kan, sebab the society is very dynamic and every institution would have an impact on another institution. So benda tu dia tak mudah lah. Dia bukan macam kita boleh come up with a solution very easily, because human lives are complicated like that. But it doesn't mean that it cannot change, kan? It doesn't mean that it's not something that is not doable. So we can see changes happening, but we have to make sure that we are thinking about it, and we're also trying to find different avenues and different social institutions yang mana kita boleh address the gender inequality. And at the same time, when we talk about poverty, kita kena look at poverty juga, and how gender affects poverty, or how poverty affects gender. Dia ada interrelations dia dekat situ. Okay. I will pass it back to the host.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fatimah, for another point to be added. It looks like that there are no questions from the Facebook audience, but I would like to ask questions. For me as an Sociology student, that I'm not specified in sociology as an expert, but I mean because as what I understood that in the philosophy of sociology, it comes from the from what Marx has done in to the case of social class struggle and minorities and the cases of that, and I think sebab kalau sebab dalam falsafah yang lain sebelum ni, falsafah adalah tentang menceritakan tentang how to think and what is truth and all that. But Marx make evolution, and he said that philosophy as practice, and that's how I understand that man maybe sees politics as the part of to practice to bring good in society, and yeah, it also relates to the economy issues, and also how education forms to form a good society. But that's why I actually also cannot understand what Dr. present, because I think when we talk about social issues, I think it's more about how we evolve ourselves into that particular context or particular social bounds. I mean, because we don't have the enough social imagination, I think, yeah, because that's why some I mean the stigmas form in because of our short-sightedness in kata tu pandang benda-benda macam ni, macam contoh dalam social media, it's not the reality, yeah. But saya pun tak faham apakah atau is patriarchy is an ideology or is it a phenomenon? Yeah, maybe doktor boleh terangkan sikit pasal tu.
Okay, all right. Maybe I can talk first about social imagination, ataupun in this context, how sometimes it escapes us, ataupun if we are not part of the experience, it's hard for us to understand how people experience it, or what is the gravity of the experience. Obviously, number one, we can always look at the data, right? We can look at macro data in terms of rates of pay gap ke, we can look at issues relating to domestic violence ke, violence against women. These are data that can help us or give us an idea at the macro level what's happening. But even at the personal level, say for example, we see an issue, kan? We are not trying to do research, kita orang biasa contohnya, but we want to know what's happening. So I think the first and most important thing for us to do is to develop curiosity. And curiosity is our inquisitiveness to know something. And most of the time we have to put aside whatever prejudgments ataupun pre-assumptions that we have. The other thing is, when we don't see something, sometimes it's because of our privilege, kan? We are very privileged not to have to experience something. So kita tak nampak how people are experiencing their life. Contohnya, if we come from a middle income family, kita pergi sekolah, mak ayah kita hantar kita pergi sekolah naik kereta, kan? Setiap hari pergi sekolah naik kereta. Kalau tak siap homework, sempat lagi buat dalam kereta. Ataupun kalau penat, boleh tidur dalam kereta. As opposed to another kid yang nak pergi sekolah kena jalan kaki. Right? Dia tak ada opportunity untuk buat homework dalam kereta. Dia tak ada opportunity untuk spend time dengan family dia dalam kereta. Contohnya dengan parents dia, to have conversations about life, to understand about this and that, to tell their parents their problems ke apa ke. They don't have that opportunity because that time is spent for them to walk to school, which is different from us. Tapi we cannot see that sometimes. Kita naik kereta, kita just think that that's how you go to school. So when our friends say it's hard for them to go to school, kita pun macam, I have to go to school too every day, kan? Tapi it escapes us what the impact of our privilege too is actually on our future, contohnya. So in the same way when we talk about gender issues, kadang-kadang it's difficult for men to understand what women go through. Because sometimes, for example, when we talk about microaggressions, again, simple but not good things, okay, but not like funny things ke. For example, being catcalled or not feeling safe in a space, kan? How often do men not feel safe in a space, kan, versus how women not feel safe in a space? Sama juga how women don't feel confident to be able to speak up. Why is that? Why does that happen, kan? In terms of children, given opportunity to speak up, to given opportunity to ask, or people asking them their opinions, contohnya. So curiosity is a very important tool to have for us to try to imagine ataupun to try to ask people how they're experiencing life and to try to see things in terms of what they see without us putting our presumption first. Benda tu is very important lah, so that kita boleh nampak. Kadang-kadang it's hard for us to see things, especially bila our privilege is being questioned. That's very hard for everybody, whether it is the privilege of wealth, whether it's the privilege of ethnicity, whether it's the privilege of gender. So curiosity would be a good place to start, just to see what is it that this person is trying to say and how is it that they're experiencing life. Kalau kita contohnya tak nak tengok data, ataupun kita dah tengok data tapi kita macam still think there's something more to look at. Okay, so maybe that's the first part lah. Second part, you're asking about patriarchy, kan? When we talk about patriarchy, we're talking about a system of power. And to explain patriarchy is quite a big topic. I'll try to simplify it as best as I can. Essentially, we're looking at a system of power which benefits male, which gives more opportunities to men, or which gives an assumed sense of power ataupun authority or dominance to men. And the system of power relating to gender is always relative. Dia bukan satu saja. Whenever we talk about inequality, apa-apa like inequality, whether it's patriarchy ke, whether it's wealth inequality ke, ethnic inequality, it's always relative. It's always between two groups. So if we're talking about inequality, one person has, the other person does not have. So when we're talking about the dominance of men, when we're talking about the authority of men, we're also talking about the submissiveness of women. We're also talking about expecting women to listen or expecting women not to have authority. So that is the system of power dekat situ. Sebab tu when women challenge that, for example by being more dominant ataupun by having control or demanding control or wanting to make decision, it challenges the other because it's always relative. So bila women want to take control over their lives, then the masculinity in this context, but patriarchy is a system of gender dynamics kan, ataupun gender power dynamics. So it challenges the male. Sebab tu we can see the pushback tadi yang I cakap tu. So when we talk about equality, when women take control over their own lives, for example, or their decisions or their bodies, it does not challenge the other gender. Dekat situ kita boleh nampak. Or when women have financial control, it does not reflect poorly on men. Tapi in a system of patriarchy, when women have financial power or financial control, it is relative. That means it is challenging men's ability to provide. Tapi sebenarnya in a system of equality, it doesn't. It just means that two people now have financial control over their lives. And in fact, it can benefit both and it can benefit the economy of the society. So dekat situ it's important for us to see systems of power relating to gender and how, whether it's patriarchy ke, matriarchy ke, how it impacts everywhere in terms of life, in terms of, for example, women taking leading roles in organizations kan. It's not a reflection of male not having, not being masculine enough, because leading roles may not have a gendered connotation. Tapi in a system of patriarchy, where men are expected to be in power, of course it would have a gendered punya connotation. Of course it would be considered having power is masculine. Tapi in a system where it's not true, then we can see sama juga in terms of education kan, where men are expected to be more educated than women. Then in this context, women cannot be teachers of men. So in a patriarchal society, that would be true. But in a society where we are practicing equality in terms of access to education, in terms of opportunity, rights, responsibilities of education, we don't see that. For example, if we look at Muslim societies in the present, it's hard to see because we are definitely affected by patriarchy. Tapi if we look at the time of the Prophet SAW, for example, ataupun after that, we can see muhadithats or ataupun the teachers of men, ada je women kan. The person that narrates the most amount of hadith was a female. During the time of the Prophet SAW, women went to war together with men, macam tu. And it didn't challenge the masculinity of men. It wasn't challenging the masculinity of men. And if it did, it was also because there was patriarchy during that time. And then it was corrected by Islamic principles that was brought during that time. So if we look at patriarchy, we have to understand it as a system of power dynamics. And it's always relative to another. The reason why ada pushback too is because one assuming or taking over ataupun getting their rights, responsibilities and opportunities somehow seems to be macam represented as taking the other persons, but it's actually not true because of the system of power dynamics too. That is how it is being portrayed. So we have to macam take a step back lah. Does it really mean that if women suddenly pergi kerja, then the husband is not masculine, contohnya kan? Ataupun kalau isteri dia make more money, suddenly the masculinity of the husband is challenged. So these are the things that we can observe lah, that we can see how power dynamics affects the society if we talk about patriarchy contohnya. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Fatimah. We have 30 minutes left more if you continue. Maybe from the previous commentator, if they want to comment. Yeah.
Doctor, I have questions. Okay, I have two questions. So from what you explained about the patriarchy things, when you say about we want to educate women, when in the process of making change means that we want to educate men to make them understand that, for example, when women lead a certain place or a certain position, it doesn't mean that this want to downgrade the men. So what is actually the core problem in the aspect of the men that doesn't want to change? Apa sebenarnya problem yang raised up because of the inferiority, or ataupun the men themselves feel kalau memang kalau memang woman yang lead, benda ni dah jadi downgrade. My question is, what is actually the root cause of change yang tak boleh nak diimplement lagi? That is the first question. The second question is about the period poverty. Saya ada terbaca tentang issue of women yang wanting to always get pregnant because diorang nak save money for buying the pets. Walaupun kita fikir secara rationalnya, you getting the child tu lagi banyak the cost to live with, kan. So this is what actually, aside from the elements yang you mentioned, diorang ni tak ada access to pet, lepas tu tak ada access to the reproductive education. What are actually, ada tak benda-benda lain yang sebenarnya can we say tersembunyi within the issue of period poverty ni sebenarnya? Is it because of mental health, or is it because of faktor-faktor lain that along the research that you did? Okay, that are my two questions.
Thank you, Sister Roya. Okay, very interesting questions. For the first question relating to patriarchy and pushback tu lah kan. I don't know why people have macam personal reasons, kan. Maybe those things we can ask them, kan, what seems to be bothering them in terms of women taking over. Daripada situ, actually sometimes we can just ask, and it's helpful also. Sometimes benda tu is also it's something that is disruptive, but there's positive disruption because it also challenges people to think. Bukanlah kita nak try to be macam to provoke people, but just to ask, like, why is it that you think that women cannot take on this role, kan? What do you think is the reason why women inherently tak boleh? Daripada situ we can see, and they may be able to question their own presumptions lah ataupun assumptions about gender roles. But most of the time it has to do with patriarchy and masculinities, and how tadi kan kita cakap kan masculinity and femininity is very contextual. In some societies, masculinity relates to dominance or authority at the workplace. In other places mungkin kurang. In some places maybe masculinity relates to people's voice ke, emotion ke, macam tu. So in the context where when we talk about patriarchy, masculinity is attached to dominance and it's also attached to authority. So naturally within a patriarchal society, if women take over the dominance ataupun take over authority, it challenges the masculinity lah in that context. It doesn't, masculinity tak rigid, sama juga macam femininity, but because it challenges them, then there is also that pushback. Sama juga macam issue about things that are feminine. Kan, in today's society, femininity also includes strength, kan. Tapi dulu, maybe if we think like 20 years ago, it would not be feminine for women to join sports, ke macam tu kan, ataupun for women to do weights, kan, macam weightlifting. It's not a feminine thing. So kalau kita nampak ataupun people in that context sees other women who lift weights, dia akan rasa macam, you shouldn't be doing that, macam tu kan. Like women tak boleh buat benda-benda macam ni. So it is something that macam kita cakap dah, satu dia ada internal punya forces yang we already learn, and then there's also the external thing that reinforces it. Macam tu lah. So in this context, if women take over the authority, and then it may challenge the masculinity of that man, macam tu. So we are looking at the gender roles tu lah. So we can always try to disrupt that in terms of trying to ask what is it that really bothers people in terms of women taking over the roles. And sometimes just asking that question allows people to think about it. Okay, about period poverty. I can talk about period poverty for a long time. Okay, issue pasal women get pregnant tu kan, I think it is too viral, kan. Based on my research and also from interacting with a lot of grassroots punya organisation, okay, actually the number of people who actually choose to get pregnant rather than to go through menstruation in poverty is very, very small. So that should not be people's picture of what period poverty is. That is not the image that people should remember when they talk about period poverty. These are very severe cases, and And the cases that I've heard are not cases that happens in urban area. Because we all know if we live in the urban area, bukan murah kan, bukan senang nak besarkan anak. The financial implications of raising children is definitely much more than managing menstruation. So in the context where this happens, the two cases that I know is very rural, remote areas where the life is completely different. Kan? Raising children and the cost of raising children affects them differently. And in context where they are they are farmers contohnya, ataupun they are self-sustaining in terms of macam they grow their own fruits and vegetables, jaga dia punya own ayam dan sebagainya. Anak-anak ni dia punya the cost of children tu tak sama dengan hidup di bandar. So the way that they see the world and the way that they understand the world is also different. So the way that we try to understand how they manage menstrual poverty pun kena make sense to that, not based on our own lens of like mahal lah nak hantar nak pergi sekolah, nak hantar nak pergi tuition, because in those rural remote areas they don't send their children sometimes to school even. So the liability or the cost of raising children too might not be something that they think about as much. Satu lagi case of choosing pregnancy over menstrual hygiene management. Okay, the other one pasal the aspect of period poverty kan. Period poverty ni affects a lot of women actually, and in the context of Malaysia, I see it affecting women from different age groups, women from different economic levels. Contohnya, I berani nak bawa isu viral dekat sini. Contohnya isu viral pasal a brand kan, recently the last few days ni brand portraying female genitalia. Okay, I bukan nak address yang tu lah. I nak cakap daripada isu tu je, we can see how many women do not know what was the name of the part that was presented in the product. Women themselves don't know what that organ is called. Dekat situ kita boleh tahu how little our women might know about their menstrual cycle, what is normal, what is not normal, their reproductive health. So not having access to education relating to menstrual health could be affecting a lot of our people in Malaysia. So that's a form of period poverty. Kan? So that's a lot. Bukan, we're not talking about one or two women. We're not talking a group of women yang ataupun a group of girls yang tak pergi sekolah, so cikgu tak ajar ke apa ke. We're talking about a large population in our society. So that's one area of period poverty that we have to address, and that is strengthened by the culture of concealment ataupun the taboo and stigma relating to period. Kan, and a bunch of other things lah that is more likely held together by gender inequality kan. Itu satu. The other one is when we talk about stigma and how stigma impacts period poverty, and maybe of interest to you lah kan, because you in psychology and mental health, how people experience period poverty and how that affects their mental health. Satu, or how general public experience menstruation and how that affects their understanding of themselves or their self-esteem, the inability to manage menstruation contohnya kan. It's very hard for us to identify who is experiencing menstrual poverty ataupun period poverty in all of the elements. Sebab to come out and say that I need help is very hard because issue tu taboo. Not only for the women but also for the community. I selalu share this story. Kita nak bantu satu kawasan ni lah. Tapi obviously in the context of our society, dia punya pengerusi kawasan tu misalnya lelaki kan, most of the time. Okay, it's not always. Sometimes we have pengerusi yang perempuan, tapi pengerusi dia lelaki. So we know that there are women in that area yang perlukan menstrual product. So they are affected by poverty relating to menstrual product. So kita minta tolong pengerusi tu boleh tak tanya berapa orang dalam kawasan ni yang perlukan bantuan menstrual product. So it's actually we are trying to access the people lah, sebab kita pun orang luar kan. Kita cuma tahu one or two tapi kita nak try together lah so that we can help kan. Dia punya response, tak boleh lah doktor, malu. It's personal, I cannot help you. So you can imagine, dia punya stigma, dia punya malu about menstruation, and his authority and his position of power is stopping him from helping his people that are under his care. So kita boleh nampak how, like, again we talk about feminization of poverty lah. By being female, dah lah you are going through poverty, not having access to product, and then you nak dapatkan bantuan, it's stigmatized. And then the person that's supposed to help you pun malu nak tolong you. So we can see that the implications are a lot, kan? And how we cannot escape. Period cannot be a female only issue that only female will address alone. It is a societal issue that we have to address together, that we have to be able to talk about it in a safe and healthy way so that benda tu productive. Bukan constantly we are battling stigma. Constantly the question is always about this stigma, that stigma. We have to be able to talk about it in a safe and healthy punya way that is productive for the people who need the support and who need the help too. Kat situ lah. Maybe ada lagi banyak benda boleh cerita tapi I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Fatimah, again. And maybe another last comment or additional points from Brother Akil.
Oh tak, saya nak tanya soalan sebenarnya. Boleh ke? So my question is that as far as I know, gender roles ni are a part of a lot of traditional societies, and that the concept of macam trying to break gender roles is, I think, a relatively new idea or phenomenon. And part of that is, I think some people try to justify the idea of gender roles with Islamic notions. You know, they would cite like how men have different obligations yang dah, you know, sort of clearly defined in Islam, and women have different obligations. So how do you reconcile this with, you know, the advocacy of trying to break gender roles?
Thank you, Akil. Oh, this is such a big question to address, kan? Okay, this is a challenge for me to try to make this very concise. Okay, so one conversation is for us to understand as Muslims, and if we want to understand the Islamic position on gender roles and authority, that is a whole discourse. Can for us to look at the text, for us to understand the text, for us to look at the interpretations of the text, and that's what we call the ideal parts of our religion, kan? And that is the guide juga for us as Muslims to understand what is okay, what is not okay, and that's very important. Number two, we also look at contemporary practice, and also we look at the Muslim today, because the ideal Islamic understanding and practice is one thing. What is being practiced and understood and upheld today could be, and most of the time it is a different version of that. So we have to acknowledge that. So if you're talking about gender roles too, I wonder if you are referring to what is understood today, or you are referring to macam the ideal context too?
I'm not sure about. I don't know if the current understanding today is the same as, say, macam the ideal context. So like whichever would be fine, I guess.
Okay, I think we have to acknowledge that for example, context of taat suami. Tanggungjawab isteri is to taat suami. Kalau suami suruh buat something, dia kena dengar. So we can see dominance, and then we can see submissiveness. This is the gender role lah. The male is dominant and the female is submissive, kan? Where it does not follow the ideal, contohnya, I give an example. Isteri kena pukul dengan suami, okay? Lepas tu isteri nak keluar. Obviously, because dia dah kena abuse, she wants to go out to make a report, okay? And then the husband say, kalau you keluar rumah ni, you nusyus. So what is the role of the wife now? Untuk taat suami and perform her gender role ataupun tidak? So that's important for us to see, because it's not always a one size fits all punya application. In this context, unfortunately, sometimes or a lot of the times, kalau kita tengok issues of abuse in Malaysia, the women would actually listen to the husband because dia tak break the gender role, dia tak nak break dia punya gender role according to what she thinks or what is the husband is implying to her, or the society pun sometimes imply to her that dia kena taat dan dia kena duduk. Kalau tak ada nanti jatuh talak. But in this context, actually her safety is priority. Her safety is important. In the ideal context in Islam, it's based on maqasid Sharia, the protection of her life is more important. And it doesn't, and him hitting her the first time too was nushuz, rather than him telling her kalau you keluar nushuz. But because of the patriarchy and gender role, dia jadi misunderstood, and then it becomes ill practiced. Dan pada masa yang sama, the family ataupun other people sometimes imposes, why did you leave? Patutnya you taat je lah dekat dia, dengar lah apa dia cakap, macam tu. So you can see how kita ada ideal and then kita ada practice. And sometimes it is practice dah salah, practice tu dah tak betul dah sebenarnya, tak ikut pun. Tapi dia dipackagekan, it is being packaged as something that is Islamic. So as Muslims, our responsibility is to unpack that balik semula, to really try to see, and we have to face it lah. Malu lah kita, sebab kalau kita orang Islam, kita lah malu. Like this is happening, tapi kita tak nak tengok. We refuse to see the reality. We want to go back to the ideal. Tapi kita tak nak face like, hey, I actually have a responsibility to address this issue, and this is not right. Macam tu. So I think in terms of reconciling tu sebenarnya, it takes our initiative to see what is happening in reality and then to look at the discourse. Sebab the discourse tu happens between scholars in terms of interpreting tu. Tapi we can clearly see, obviously, the scholars would not agree to the abuse of women, kan? So benda-benda macam tu lah. We have to, as orang biasa contohnya, we have to learn. We have to take the initiative to educate ourselves better on our religion. And then if we are at the level of people who are supposed to educate people, then we have to also address these issues clearly and openly. Kita tak boleh macam try to hide behind certain things. So it depends on where we are, kan, macam fardu kifayah ke, macam tu. It depends on where we are in the society and our roles and what we're supposed to do in those roles. So we can reconcile it based on those areas lah, whether we are actually being real with ourselves in terms of the reality and the ideal ataupun tidak. So I hope that my response answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Fatimah, for the answer. And so it seems that we have finally reached to the end of our program tonight. And thanks again for all our audience in Facebook for staying us until the end. And thank you for the comments from Brother Akil and Sister Ruhiyah. I think to conclude that what can be concluded from this program tonight, that Islam taught us to be humane and to be understanding both others and their social conditions, and to understand people, and to have empathy. So thank you also, and make sure to follow School of Islamic Thought in Instagram, Twitter, and other platforms. And with that, wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi. And we see again in next program, inshallah.